Hi, Ranger Leo here to welcome you back for the final story in this year's 11th annual Blue Heron Ghost Train. Tonight I'm standing on the train depot deck surrounded by the interpretive exhibits that tell the story of this place with light provided by candles and a lantern. And to my right is an old rocking chair with a blanket draped over it and a table with a quilt. Tonight's storyteller is Beth Kilburn, and she will be sharing with us a tale about a visit from a Headless Haint. I want to thank you for being a part of this year's Ghost Train, and I hope you enjoy tonight's story. I will now trade places with Beth.
I will never forget the first time I heard this story. I couldn't have been no more than 6 years old. I had gone over to my granny and pa daddy's to spend the night, and Granny was tucking me into the bed, and I looked over at her and I said, "Granny, would you tell me a bedtime story?" She looked back at me and she said, "Beth Ann, I don't know any bedtime stories." I said, "Oh, Granny, yes you do. You tell them all the time. One of those stories that starts out with, 'Once upon a time.'" Well, she looked back at me and she said, "Are you talking about one of those stories that ends in a happily ever after?" And I said, "Yes, Granny, that's exactly what I want." So she thought for a minute. She pulled up a chair beside of the bed, and this is the story I heard. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, there lived a young man and young woman. They was newlyweds, and they had fell onto hard times. So they had decided to take off a walking down this long dirt road in hopes of finding a better life. Well, they had already been walking for days, and that's when the cold set in. And with the cold came the rain. And the longer they walked, each step they took, their shoes was beginning to stick in the mud. And so by the time night fell that evening, the wife looked over at her husband and she said, "I just don't know how much longer I can go on." She said, "I'm so tired and cold and I'm getting hungry." Well, her husband took her by the hand and he said, "We don't have much choice. We've got to keep walking so as we can find us some kind of shelter for the night." So they kept walking down this long dirt road. And just as they topped the next knoll, that's when they saw it. Sitting over in a big field was a house, and the light was a flickering from the front windows. And they took off through this field to that house as fast as their legs would carry them. And when they got up to that house, oh, they could see that it wasn't just any house, but it was a big, fine home with big columns. And it looked to them like the kind of a house that rich folk might live in. So they looked at each other, soaked clean down through to the bone and muddy. So they decided, we best go around to the back door and knock. So that's exactly what they did. And when they got to the back door and knocked, they heard a voice. And it said, "Come on in." So they opened the door and they stepped inside. But there was nobody there. But what they did see was a big, fine kitchen with everything a body would need for cooking. Oh, wow, there was pots and pans hanging everywhere, and flour and sugar and lard, and then they spied the fireplace. And on the top rack of the fireplace was a pot of beans a-cooking. And sitting amongst the hot coals was a rabbit a-boiling. And did it ever smell good. "Hello!" the man called out once more, and still nobody came. So the husband and the wife, they got to talking betwixt each other. They said, well, now you heard it as well as I did. Somebody definitely told us to come on in. And this food was definitely cooked for somebody and needs to be ate tonight. I think it was meant for us. He said, I tell you what I'm going to do. He said, I am going to step out to the well house and fetch us a pail of water so as we can at least have us a good cup of hot coffee to go with them beans and that rabbit. She said, well, while you're outside doing that, she said, I'm going to pull me up a chair to the fireplace and knock the chill off of me. So he went outside and she pulled her up a chair. She took off her Mettie's shoes and then she started peeling off her wet stockings. And she reared back in the chair just to rest for just a minute, and she shut her eyes. And when she opened her eyes back up, right in front of her stood a man. Oh, and he was dressed in fine clothes, he was. He had on a pair of those big, high riding boots that went up to his knees. He had on a pair of gray flannel trousers. He had on a navy blue wool blazer. He had on a fine white starched shirt with one of those big high white collars. That man never had no head. There was nothing sticking out of that collar but a raw neck and a bloody stump. Lord, that woman, she hopped up out of that chair and she said, what in the name of the Lord is you a-wanting? And that's when that Headless Haint commenced a-talking. Now, keep in mind, he never had no mouth, 'cause he never had no head, but he was a-talking all the same. And he said, I'm in awful misery, awful misery. Please, will you help me? And then he commenced to talking more, and he said, about a few months back, he said some robbers come to my house and demanded that I tell them where my riches was. He said, and I wouldn't do it. He said, they got so mad, they killed me right away. He said, they spent the next several days looking around my place and property for my riches, never could find it. He said, and they was so mad when they come back to the house and seen me a-laying there, they decided to chop off my head. He said, then they dragged me down to the cellar and dug a hole and buried my body in it. Then they took my head clear to the other side of the cellar and buried it. So he said, you see, I've been in awful misery all of this time, because a body just can't rest in eternal peace if it's buried in two separate places. Well, that woman looked at that old Headless Haint and she said, now you mean to tell me that in all of this time that there ain't been nobody stopped by this big house that could have helped you none? That Headless Haint looked at her and he said, well, there's been all sorts of people that stopped by, but he said they take one look at me and out the door they run. He said, but tonight, when you ask in the name of the Lord, he said, all of a sudden I was able to start talking. Well, it was just about that time that her husband came back in through that kitchen door. And when he seen that Headless Haint, he just about jumped out of his skin. Lord have mercy. That woman, she had to calm her husband down, and then she introduced the Headless Haint to her husband. And that is when that Headless Haint commenced a talking all over again, because he wanted her husband to know exactly why he was the way that he was. So he said, see, he said, please, will you all help me get out of this misery? He said, I promise you that if you do help me find my head so I can be buried in one piece, I will make you very rich. Well, the man and the woman, they looked at each other and they said, sure, we will be glad to help you. And the husband spoke up and he said, but first, let me step outside and see if I can't find something to use for a torch so as we can at least see what we're doing down in that dark cellar. That old Headless Haint, he said, ain't no sense of that. And he walked right over there to that fireplace and bent over and stuck his finger right into the flames. And when he pulled his finger out, that finger was a lit up and a glowing so big and bright that it had the whole kitchen lit. And without saying nary another word, that Headless Haint turned and walked right out that kitchen door, and right down them cellar steps he went. And that man and woman was a-going right off behind him. Well, when they got down to the cellar, the Headless Haint took them over to this great big hole. He said, you all see this hole? He said, this is the very hole that I've just clumb up out of. He said, but I want you folks to follow me over this way. He took them clear over to the other side of the cellar, and he said, now right in here is where they've buried my head. He said, but before we do this, he said, I want y'all to follow me over this way. He took them to another spot in the cellar. He gave them both a shovel. He said, now right here is where I want y'all to start a-digging. So they started a-digging, and they dug. Dug for a pretty good while, and that's when they hit it. Barrels of gold. All of them. So the husband took his shovel clean to the other side of that cellar, and he started digging for that head. He shoveled for a pretty good little while. Then he found that head, and before you know it, he had that head hoisted up right onto the end of that shovel. And when that Headless Haint seen it, he went right over and took a hold of that head and stuck it right back on that bloody stump with both of his hands. Then he turned and he went over to some shelves in that cellar, and he took hold of a candle holder. Right in front of that man and woman, he pulled that finger right off of his hand and stuck it right down into that candle holder and handed it to the wife. Without saying another word, he walked right back over to that big hole, took hold of his head to make sure it's still in place, climbed right back down into that hole and stretched out real big, he did. And when he did that man, he commenced to shoveling the dirt right back over him. All of that dirt. And when he got done, they heard a voice rise up from the grave. And it was that old Headless Haint talking again. And he told them, he said, folks, he said, I will be forever grateful to you all for helping put my head with my body so I can finally get some peace. He said, you all would not believe the misery that has already been lifted. He said, now I'm leaving you my riches, but he said, I'm also going to leave you this big, fine home and all of the land that goes with it. Lord have mercy. That man and that woman, they could not believe their good fortune. They thanked that old Headless Haint over and over. And then they took that lit finger and that candle holder and marched right back up them cellar steps and right back into that kitchen door. And they set that lit finger right down in the middle of that kitchen table. And that night, they had a feast of beans and a rabbit. But you want to know something? That couple lived a long and happy life, and they raised a big family and never did want for another thing living in that big house. You know something else? They never heard another word out of that Headless Haint. For he was a-laying in that grave down in the cellar without no misery, a-resting in eternal peace, happily ever after. The end.